The fluorescent lights of the community center buzzed overhead as Pastor Marcus Whitfield slammed his fist on the folding table. His face flushed red with righteous anger as he surveyed the packed room of townspeople, their expressions ranging from supportive nods to uncomfortable shifts in their metal chairs. How long are we going to tolerate this blatant display of idolatry in our Christian community? His voice boomed across the room, echoing off the beige walls. That statue, that graven image sitting right there on Main Street, mocking everything we believe about salvation through Christ alone. Mrs. Henderson from the front row raised her hand tentatively. Pastor Whitfield, the Catholic Church has been here since 1887. That statue has been part of our town's history for generations. Marcus turned toward her, his jaw clenched tight. History built on deception, Mrs. Henderson, on the worship of false gods disguised as reverence. His childhood memories flashed through his mind, the sting of being told he couldn't participate in his Catholic neighbor's Christmas pageant because he wasn't one of them. The exclusion had festered for 37 years. Without another word, he stormed from the building. His footsteps pounded against the sidewalk as he marched the 3 blocks to St. Catherine's Catholic Church. The white marble statue of the Virgin Mary stood serenely in the garden, her hands outstretched in welcome, moonlight casting gentle shadows across her peaceful face. Marcus felt something snap inside him. All the years of feeling rejected, all the theological arguments, all the pain condensed into one explosive moment. He drew back his right foot and kicked the statue with all his strength. The crack echoed through the night air like a gunshot. Marcus stumbled backward, his heart hammering as he stared at the damage. A jagged fissure ran from the statue's base up through her flowing robes, and her left hand had broken clean off, lying in pieces on the manicured grass. Father Rodriguez emerged from the rectory, his face pale in the porch light. Behind him, 3 parishioners who had been attending evening prayer stood frozen in shock. Mrs. Santos, an elderly woman who tended the garden daily, pressed her hand to her chest and whispered something in Spanish that sounded like a prayer. Pastor Whitfield, Father Rodriguez, said quietly, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "What have you done?" Marcus felt the weight of their stares, but his anger still burned hot. What needed to be done? This town has been deceived long enough by your graven images and false worship. By morning, the news had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Marcus's phone rang incessantly as reporters and community members demanded responses. His secretary, Janet, fielded calls with increasing difficulty as the story reached social media and local news outlets. At Crossroads Community Church, the congregation gathered in hushed clusters before Sunday service. Elder Davidson approached Marcus in his office, his weathered face creased with concern. "Pastor, the board needs to discuss this situation. Half the congregation is standing behind you, but the other half is deeply troubled. The Hendersons and the Coopers have already said they're considering leaving." Marcus straightened his tie and grabbed his sermon notes. "Let them leave, Bill. Sometimes the wheat must be separated from the chaff. If stories like this move you and you believe in moments where faith meets the unexplainable, make sure you subscribe because what happens next will leave you speechless." Marcus stepped up to the pulpit that Sunday morning with fire in his eyes. The sanctuary was packed, filled not only with regular congregants, but also curious onlookers and several reporters with notebooks. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Some of you are here today expecting an apology," he began, his voice carrying across the silent room. "You're expecting me to bow down to political correctness and apologize for standing up for biblical truth." Sarah Whitfield shifted uncomfortably in the front pew, her knuckles white as she gripped her purse. She had begged him that morning to reconsider his approach, but Marcus had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "I will not apologize for striking a blow against idolatry," Marcus declared, his fist hitting the podium. "That statue represents everything that separates people from the true gospel of Jesus Christ. It represents the very deception that kept me as a child from understanding pure faith." His voice cracked slightly as memories flooded back. He was 8 years old again, standing outside St. Catherine's during their Christmas pageant, watching through the windows as the Catholic children played angels and shepherds. When he had asked his neighbor Tommy why he couldn't participate, the answer came swift and cutting. Because you're not one of us. That statue has been a symbol of division in this community for over a century. Marcus continued, his composure returning. It represents a religion that builds walls instead of bridges, that creates insiders and outsiders, that teaches people to pray to created beings instead of the Creator. The congregation sat in stunned silence. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged troubled glances. Mrs. Henderson quietly gathered her things and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the hushed sanctuary. The first sign appeared Tuesday morning during Marcus's sermon preparation. He had spent hours crafting his next message about religious deception, but when he opened his laptop, the document was completely blank. Every word had vanished as if it had never been written. "Sarah," he called from his home office, frustration evident in his voice. "Did you use my computer last night?" His wife appeared in the doorway, concern etched across her features. "Marcus, you know I never touch your laptop. Are you sure you saved it properly?" He spent the morning rewriting from memory, but during Wednesday evening service, the microphone system failed inexplicably. The sound technician, Jim Morrison, scratched his head in bewilderment. "Pastor, I've never seen anything like this." The equipment was working perfectly during sound check an hour ago. By Thursday, Marcus's balance seemed off. He stumbled slightly while walking to his car, catching himself against the door handle. At first, he attributed it to exhaustion from the stress of recent events, but the episodes became more frequent. During Friday's men's breakfast, he nearly fell while reaching for the coffee pot. Bob Stevens, a retired doctor in the congregation, noticed immediately. "Marcus, when did this balance problem start?" "It's nothing," Marcus insisted, steadying himself against the table. "Just been working too hard lately." But privately, he was beginning to worry. The unexplained technical failures, the lost documents, and now these dizzy spells created an unsettling pattern. Sarah had started watching him with worried eyes, and he caught her whispering prayers when she thought he wasn't listening. That night, lying in bed, Marcus stared at the ceiling as Sarah slept beside him. The events of the past week replayed in his mind, and for the first time since kicking the statue, a small seed of doubt crept into his thoughts. Dr. Patricia Mills studied the test results with a furrowed brow, her 25 years of neurological experience offering no clear answers. Marcus sat across from her desk, Sarah's hand clasped tightly in his, both waiting for an explanation that made sense. "Pastor Whitfield, I'm going to be completely honest with you," Dr. Mills began, removing her glasses to clean them slowly. "Your symptoms are unlike anything I've encountered. The balance issues, coordination problems, and spatial disorientation you're experiencing typically develop gradually over months or years." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "What are you saying, doctor?" "In your case, these symptoms appeared suddenly and have progressed rapidly in just 1 week. Your MRI shows no tumors, no signs of stroke, no inflammation. Your blood work is completely normal. By every medical standard, you should be perfectly healthy." Sarah squeezed his hand harder. "There has to be an explanation." Dr. Mills put her glasses back on and leaned forward. "I'm referring you to Dr. Harrison at the University Medical Center. He's one of the top neurologists in the state, specializes in rare conditions. But I have to tell you, this presents like nothing in current medical literature." The drive home was silent except for the hum of tires on asphalt. Marcus gripped the passenger seat as Sarah navigated the familiar roads, his world literally spinning even while sitting still. Simple tasks like walking to the mailbox now required careful concentration and often ended with him grabbing onto something for support. That evening, Elder Davidson called with news that made Marcus's stomach drop even further. 3 more families had announced they were leaving Crossroads Community Church, citing his increasingly erratic behavior and their discomfort with the controversy surrounding the statue incident. Sunday morning arrived with Marcus clinging to the bathroom doorframe, his legs trembling as he attempted to stand. The simple act of brushing his teeth had become a monumental challenge, requiring both hands on the sink for stability. "Marcus, you can't preach today," Sarah said firmly, watching him struggle to button his shirt. "Look at yourself. You can barely stand." He met her eyes in the mirror, seeing his own fear reflected back. "The congregation needs to hear from their pastor. I won't let them down." But as service time approached, the inevitable became clear. Marcus made it halfway down the church hallway before his legs gave out completely. Jim Morrison and Elder Davidson caught him before he hit the floor, their faces grave with concern. The emergency board meeting that afternoon was brief and painful. Marcus sat in his office chair, unable to trust his legs to support him, as the church leadership made the decision he had dreaded. "Pastor, we're recommending immediate medical leave," Elder Davidson said gently. "Dr. Thompson will fill the pulpit temporarily while you focus on getting better." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. His ministry, his calling, his entire identity wrapped up in leading this congregation was being taken away. The church he had built from 300 members to over 800 was slipping through his fingers like sand. That evening, attendance at the Wednesday service dropped to barely 200 people. Word spread quickly through Millbrook's tight-knit community that Pastor Whitfield was too sick to preach, fueling speculation about divine judgment and supernatural consequences. Sarah found him that night, sitting in his study, staring at his empty sermon notebook. "Maybe this is connected to what happened to the Catholic Church," she whispered. Sleep had become Marcus's enemy. Night after night, he lay awake listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside him, his mind racing with questions that had no medical answers. When exhaustion finally claimed him, the dreams began. The Virgin Mary statue appeared exactly as it had stood before his attack, pristine white marble gleaming in moonlight. But in his dreams, she wasn't the lifeless stone he had kicked in anger. Her eyes held depth, filled not with condemnation, but with profound sadness that seemed to reach into his soul. "Why?" she asked in a voice that sounded like his mother's, like Sarah's, like every woman who had ever shown him unconditional love. "Why do you carry such pain?" Marcus tried to speak in the dream, to justify his actions, to explain his theological position. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself 8 years old again, standing outside St. Catherine's Christmas pageant, tears streaming down his face as he watched through frosted windows. He saw himself at 12, excluded from Tommy Rodriguez's First Communion celebration. At 16, when Maria Santos politely declined his invitation to prom because her parents said Protestant boys weren't suitable. Each memory layered upon the next, building a wall of hurt and resentment brick by brick. In a dream, the Virgin Mary knelt down to his child's eyes perspective. "You were never excluded from love," she said gently. "You excluded yourself from receiving it." Marcus woke with tears on his cheeks and Sarah's concerned face hovering over him. "You were talking in your sleep again," she said softly. "You kept saying you were sorry." During his waking hours, the dreams haunted him. For the first time in decades, Marcus began to question whether his crusade against Catholic imagery had been driven by theological conviction or by the wounded heart of a lonely child. Dr. Harrison delivered the verdict with clinical precision that somehow made it worse. Marcus sat in the wheelchair Sarah had reluctantly purchased, his hands shaking not from his condition, but from fear. "The experimental treatment might slow the progression, but I cannot promise restoration of function," the specialist explained, his charts spread across the desk like a medical death sentence. "This condition appears to be irreversible. You should prepare for permanent disability." The drive home felt like a funeral procession. Marcus stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of Millbrook, knowing he might never walk them again. His pastoral career was over. His independence was gone. His identity as a strong leader had crumbled into helplessness. At home, the silence was deafening. The phone had stopped ringing with speaking invitations and pastoral consultations. The steady stream of church members seeking counsel had dried up completely. Even his closest allies on the church board now spoke to Sarah instead of him, as if his condition had rendered him invisible. That evening, Marcus wheeled himself into his study and stared at the wall of theological books that had once been his pride. Commentaries on Scripture, volumes of systematic theology, dissertations on Reformed doctrine, all meaningless now. He couldn't even hold a book steady enough to read. "Sarah," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm being punished." She appeared in the doorway, her eyes red from crying she thought he hadn't noticed. "Punished for what?" "For what I did to that statue. For the hatred I've carried. For hurting people the way I was hurt." The words came out broken, like confession dragged from the depths of his soul. "I don't know how to make it right." The decision came to Marcus at 3 in the morning, born from desperation and a broken spirit that had finally surrendered its pride. He woke Sarah with trembling hands, his voice barely audible in the darkness. "I need to go to St. Catherine's," he whispered. "I need to face what I've done." Sarah's eyes widened with concern and hope. "Marcus, are you sure? In your condition? Especially in my condition. If I'm going to spend the rest of my life in this wheelchair, I need to make peace with what put me here." The drive across town felt like a pilgrimage. Sarah helped him from the car into his wheelchair, and together they approached the church garden where the repaired statue stood bathed in early morning light. The crack had been expertly mended, but a thin line still remained visible, a permanent scar from his moment of rage. Marcus tried to wheel himself closer, but the narrow garden path proved impossible to navigate. Without hesitation, he pushed himself out of the chair and began crawling across the grass, his legs useless beneath him, his arms pulling his weight forward inch by painful inch. "Marcus, no," Sarah cried, but he pressed on, driven by a need deeper than dignity. When he reached the base of the statue, he collapsed completely, his face pressed against the cool marble foundation. The tears came then, decades of hurt and anger and loneliness pouring out in sobs that shook his entire body. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the stone figure above him. "I'm so sorry. For the statue, for the hatred, for hurting your people. I was just a scared little boy who felt left out, and I let that pain turn me into something ugly." Father Rodriguez appeared from the rectory, having witnessed the entire scene. Father Rodriguez knelt beside the broken man sprawled at the base of the statue, his heart moved by the raw desperation in Marcus's voice. Sarah stood behind them, tears streaming down her face as she watched her husband's complete surrender. "Pastor Whitfield," Father Rodriguez said gently, placing a compassionate hand on Marcus's shoulder, "your heart is heard." As Marcus continued to weep, something extraordinary began to happen. Mrs. Santos, who had been tending the early morning roses, stopped her gardening and stared in amazement. A warm, golden light seemed to emanate from the statue itself, growing brighter with each passing moment. Sarah gasped and stepped closer. "Do you see that?" Father Rodriguez nodded, his eyes wide with wonder. The light wasn't reflecting from any external source, but appeared to be radiating from within the marble itself, casting a gentle glow over Marcus's trembling form. Other witnesses began to gather. Jim Morrison, who had been jogging past, stopped dead in his tracks. Mrs. Henderson, despite her anger over the incident, felt compelled to approach from across the street. Dr. Stevens, making his morning house calls, pulled over and stepped out of his car. The light intensified, and Marcus felt warmth spreading through his body, starting from where his face touched the statue's base. The sensation moved through his arms, down his spine, into his legs that had been useless for weeks. Slowly, tentatively, Marcus placed his palms flat against the ground and pushed. His arms, which had grown weak from supporting his body weight, suddenly felt strong. His legs, which had betrayed him for so long, began to respond. "Sarah," he whispered in amazement, "I can feel my legs." Before the gathered witnesses, Marcus Whitfield rose to his feet, steady and strong, bathed in light that defied explanation. Word of Marcus's miraculous healing spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire. By afternoon, his phone buzzed constantly with calls from congregation members, local reporters, and curious onlookers wanted to verify what seemed impossible. Dr. Mills examined him that very day, her medical instruments confirming what her eyes could hardly believe. "Pastor Whitfield, according to every test I can run, you have perfect neurological function. No trace of the condition that left you wheelchair-bound just hours ago." But the greater transformation was evident to everyone who knew Marcus before. Gone was the rigid anger that had defined his ministry for years. In its place stood a man humbled by grace, speaking with newfound compassion about the mystery of divine love. Sunday morning at Crossroads Community Church drew the largest crowd in the building's history. People packed the sanctuary, spilled into the overflow rooms, and stood along the walls. Marcus took the pulpit with steady legs and a transformed heart. 3 weeks ago, I stood in this very spot and defended hatred disguised as theological conviction. He began, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent for years. I told you that I struck a blow against idolatry. Today I tell you that I struck a blow against love itself. The congregation sat in absolute silence as Marcus recounted his journey from pride to humility, from sickness to miraculous healing. He spoke of childhood wounds that had festered into adult prejudice, and of a God whose mercy exceeded human understanding. "I have spent 30 years preaching about grace," Marcus continued, "but I had never truly received it until I lay broken at the feet of the very statue I had desecrated. In that moment, I learned that divine love flows through many vessels, and our job is not to judge the vessel, but to recognize the love." 6 months later, the joint worship service between Crossroads Community Church and St. Catherine's Catholic Church filled both sanctuaries simultaneously, connected by live video feed. Marcus stood beside Father Rodriguez at the shared altar they had constructed in the church garden, right next to the Virgin Mary statue that bore its thin scar like a badge of redemption. Today we celebrate not our theological differences, but our shared humanity, Marcus announced to the combined congregations. We celebrate the mystery of divine love that works through our brokenness to create something beautiful. The Millbrook Interfaith Council, born from Marcus's transformation, had grown to include not only Protestant and Catholic churches, but also the small Jewish synagogue and the recently established mosque. Mrs. Santos, who had witnessed the miraculous healing, now served as the council's secretary, her garden-worn hands typing meeting minutes that planned community service projects and interfaith dialogue sessions. Sarah sat in the front row, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her husband lead prayers with the same Father Rodriguez he had once despised. The congregation sang together, voices blending in harmonies that transcended denominational boundaries. As the service concluded, Marcus walked to the Virgin Mary statue and placed a gentle hand on the marble base where he had once collapsed in desperation. The scar remained visible, a permanent reminder that even our deepest wounds could become sources of healing for others. Dr. Mills attended that day, still unable to medically explain Marcus's recovery, but no longer needing to. She had documented his healing from medical journals, adding her professional testimony to the growing collection of witness statements. Have you ever witnessed something that science couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments below, and let us know if you've experienced moments where the impossible became possible. The miracle at St. Catherine's had transformed more than one man's legs. It had healed an entire community's heart.